of cognitive training and how it can be beneficial in general to young and older people as well. And then finally, I'll talk about my specific project, which describes how we're using eye movement training as a form of cognitive training and show you some preliminary results. Okay, sorry. So as you probably know, Parkinson's disease is a neurodegenerative brain disorder, and that results primarily in problems with the control of movement. So these include things like persistent tremors of the hands here, slowness of movement, there's a stiffness, there's problems with balance, so forth. However, Parkinson's disease also results in cognitive difficulties, which are also known as non-motor symptoms. So these are things such as memory. So people with Parkinson's may have difficulty remembering things like memorizing your shopping list or remembering whether you shut the stove off this morning or not when you left, things like that. There's also problems with concentration. So this is really, for example, concentrating on a task at hand and not getting distracted, things like that. There's problems with paying attention. So for example, I'm going to be probably talking to you on the next 45 minutes or so, and I hope that you'll be paying attention to what I say throughout, but this takes a lot of effort. And people with Parkinson's experience difficulty in paying attention and in also maintaining attention. So another cognitive skill we have is planning, which is that we have to plan many things in our daily life. So for example, if you want to go shopping and we need to plan out which shops we want to go to, which route we want to take to get to these shops, or if you wanted to go on a trip or a vacation, this requires planning as well. And then finally, in the long term, we make many plans for our future, what we want to do in the next year, the next 5 years, and so forth. Finally, there's things like making decisions. So we make decisions all the time. For example, which brand of detergent to buy, whether we want to drive, whether we want to take the bus, whether we're going to go out for an evening or stay home, which show we want to watch on TV, and so forth. So the question here is, we have all these cognitive skills, and people with Parkinson's have difficulties with these cognitive skills. And the question is, why do Parkinson's have these motor difficulties and cognitive difficulties as well? And the reason being is it's because of a decrease in the nerve cells that make a certain chemical called dopamine. So here I'm showing you a picture of the brain. You can see the brain in the person's head here. So this is the front of the head, where you're near your hairline, for example. And this is the back of your head. This is the cerebellum. And these structures in the middle, right in the inside of the brain, close to the middle, are called the basal ganglia, and they're made up of a bunch of different number of structures. And these different brain areas are connected to one another. So nerve cells in the basal ganglia make a chemical called dopamine. And this is what we need to control different parts of the brain. Now, Parkinson's disease occurs when these nerves or these neurons slowly get destroyed, they slowly degenerate. And so what they do is make less and less dopamine. And so without dopamine, the basal ganglia cannot properly send messages to the rest of the brain. So generally what it does is it sends messages to all the different parts of the brain in the cortex. So the basal ganglia connects with different parts of the cortex, which is this outermost part of the brain here, all around here. And these different parts of the cortex have different functions for how we go about our daily life. And so the basal ganglia are connected to these different parts of the cortex through different routes. So first there's the motor route. So the motor route connects part of the basal ganglia, which is shown in this icon here. So these are all those different structures of the basal ganglia I mentioned before. And it connects to the primary motor cortex. And this is this part of the brain that's highlighted here. And it is this area of the cortex that controls muscles and movements. So it controls how we move our arms, our legs, our torso, and so forth. Now, because there's a decrease of dopamine in the basal ganglia here, it affects the movement control here. So it can't send messages properly to the motor cortex. And that's why you have motor symptoms. Now, there's a second different route, which now connects the basal ganglia, again, you see here in this icon, to the frontal cortex, which is this part of the brain. So this is near the front of the head. Here's the back of the head. So this area here is known as the frontal cortex. So this frontal cortex is a part of the cortex with which you think. So this is a part of the brain that you would use to pay attention, to make decisions like play bridge or plan something, to remember things, so forth. So similarly to the motor route, when there's a deficit of dopamine in the basal ganglia, it affects the frontal cortex. So there are problems sending messages to the frontal cortex, and this results in problems with cognitive abilities or these non-motor symptoms. So now, as you can see in this figure, the parts and the connections inside the basal ganglia are not the same. So you can see there's different parts of the basal ganglia. For example, this structure here that's involved in the cognitive route that is not involved in the motor route, and also different parts of the structures that are involved. For example, this area here, you can see that the motor route involves this part of this structure, whereas it involves a different part of the structure for the cognitive route. Now, this is a simplified version of the previous slide that I showed you. So it shows again that there are these different routes that involve different parts of the basal ganglia that connect to the cortex. And so you have the motor route and the cognitive route that involve different parts of the cortex and different parts of the basal ganglia. So what this means is that dopamine will affect the different routes differently. So when you have Parkinson's disease, there's a decrease in dopamine. And typically what happens is you are given a dopamine replacement drug, which it's typically prescribed. And what this does is replace the dopamine that's missing in the brain, in the basal ganglia. But because of the different pathways, the drug has different effects for the different routes. So what I mean by this is, if you give a dopamine drug that's just enough to make the motor symptoms better, this amount of dopamine might be too little to improve the cognitive symptoms, or vice versa. There might be too much. It might be too much for the cognitive symptoms and result in other problems. So what we want to do is find a different way to improve the cognitive abilities without changing what works for the motor symptoms. So this level of dopamine works for the motor system, but might not work so well for the cognitive. So it would be good if we could find other ways to improve the cognitive symptoms without affecting the motor symptoms. So because of this, because dopamine drugs show different results, they affect the cognitive route differently from the motor route, we need different treatments for the cognitive symptoms. So they show mixed results for the cognitive symptoms. There's some new research going on that looks at different drugs that focus specifically on the cognitive symptoms, but there's very little research so far on this. So it's important to look for other ways to improve the cognitive abilities. And one of these ways is cognitive training, which has a lot of potential but has not been explored very much for Parkinson's disease. So before I talk about cognitive training in relation to Parkinson's disease, let me tell you a bit about what cognitive training is. So the theory behind it is that the brain can be thought of as a muscle. And just like a muscle, you have to use it or otherwise it will deteriorate. So for the brain, through practicing cognitive tasks, cognitive abilities can be maintained, not get worse, or they can be improved, so you get better at something. So I'm simply talking about practice makes perfect. So For example, if you're learning to play a piano, the more you practice, the better you get. And the same way, if you practice remembering, the better you get at it. So there's all kinds of different types of cognitive training methodologies that are in the research field today. And all they do, the different kinds focus on different aspects of cognitive skills. So for example, there are many studies that use memorization training. So this way you're learning to remember better. So, memory games that kids play, learn to remember the order that something was presented in. You memorize a list and then go do something else and then try to recall what you memorized after a period of time. All these are kind of training to help improve memory. Other types of training include things like focused attention. So in this kind of training, what you're doing is you're learning how to stay focused on one thing and how to ignore other things. So for example, this task here, what you would be asked to do is to ignore what's actually written and just say the color of the object. And it's very hard to do. You can try it yourself. So here would be red, red, green. So you see this one, it's much easier just to read the word than to actually figure out what color it is. But this helps you focus on the color and ignore the actual word. So here it would be green, red, green. Oh, wait. See, I get confused too. Green, red, red. So it's a very difficult task. But if you practice, you get better at it. There's also things like planning. So you can train to learn, for example, how to plan a route through a building or plan a sequence of steps to solve a problem. So this kind of helps you determine what to do and plan things in sequence and so forth. There's action video games. And in fact, there have been a lot of studies on this that look at how playing these kinds of action video games, so first-person shooter, which unfortunately are violent, or these car racing games, and so forth. And it actually shows that playing these games will help with all kinds of things such as memory and focusing and planning, and also this focused attention idea that ignoring things that don't matter. And they've shown very good, robust results in improving a wide range of cognitive skills. So as I mentioned before, there's also learning a new skill, such as learning a new language or a new musical instrument, learning to play the piano. And so all these studies, what they do is they use different measures to show that the brain gets better. For example, they can use brain imaging or testing how well you improve on a certain task after you've trained in it. And how it works in the brain is quite interesting. So what does it actually do to the brain, all these different kinds of cognitive training? So what we start with is a neuron. So this is a neuron, and this is a nerve cell in the brain. This is what it looks like. And the brain is made up of millions and millions of these cells, and they're the basic building block of the brain. And they're the ones that communicate messages across the brain. So the neuron transmits information that comes in through the dendrites, which are these little branches here. And then the information travels across the axon, this long, big branched descent, till it reaches the end here. Now, these blue things around the axons are called glial cells, so these two blue things. And what they do is they provide insulation for the information. So the information is like an electrical signal. So this is just like an electrical wire. This one has the insulation helps keep the current within the wire. And if the insulation wasn't there, the current might get lost to the outside. So it's basically the glial cells these ones at least act as insulation. So when the information reaches the end of the neuron, the information has to be transmitted to the next neuron. So within a neuron, it works like an electrical signal. There's an electric potential that goes from the dendrites to the axon. But across the neuron, it does this through a chemical process. So what it does is that the branches of the axon release chemicals such as dopamine, and these chemicals are then attached to receptors on the next neuron, and that's how the information that gets transferred into an electrical signal to go to the next neuron, and that's how information gets sent from one neuron to the other. So this is a close-up of this idea. So you have all these little balls filled with chemicals that are released from the axon of one neuron and are attached to the receptors of the next neuron. And then the same process goes on and on, so the next neuron continues its information, and this happens over and over and over again, and this is how messages are relayed across the brain. So the question is, what happens when you practice something? So a number of things happen, actually. First, what can happen is the neuron can actually grow more branches like a tree. So generally, it's understood that once you have a certain number of neurons, you don't grow more neurons, although this is being slightly disputed recently. But what we do know is that neurons can grow more branches. So just like a tree, it'll grow additional branches through practice, which can allow it to make more connections to other neurons. And what this means is you get a stronger signal that's sent from one neuron to the next. So the other thing that can happen is you can have more glial cells that are growing. So the blue ones, you see there's more here, and a bunch grew here on the other branch. So, which means that you have more insulation on the axon, and so the more insulation you have, the faster the signal can go through, just like in electricity, and the less information is lost, so the less the signal is lost. Again, just like an electrical wire. So now the current will go through faster, and there'll be less electricity that's lost, so the signal is more likely to reach the next neuron, so the message is more likely to be to reach the next neuron. Another thing that can happen is you can have stronger connections between the neurons. So this means that you would have more chemicals that are released from one neuron to make the connection to the next neuron. And so what this means is the connections get stronger, which means the signal stays stronger, and you have better messages that are sent from one neuron to the other. So this is exactly what happens when you practice something. You make more connections, you make stronger connections between the neurons, and this makes you better at doing something. So for example, let's say you're learning to ride a bike. What you're doing is you're making stronger connections between the balance part of your brain and the part of the brain that coordinates your legs and so forth. And so then you get better at riding a bike. So what I'm showing you here is this happens at the level of a single neuron, but this can happen over hundreds and thousands and millions of neurons. And what you can do is, if it happens in a big enough area of brain, you can see these changes using brain imaging. So that's what researchers do to investigate how their changes, how the brain changes in humans. So what they do is they use a functional magnetic resonance imaging, and basically they're using a magnetic field to measure activity or anatomy of the brain. So the participant normally would lie down with their head in the scanner, and then the magnetic field turns a certain way to get the neurons in the brain, the atoms in the brain, to react a certain way. And using this, they can measure the brain anatomy or the brain function. So the brain anatomy would be to look at how big the brain is and how big different parts of the brain are. So for example, here's a picture of an anatomy of a brain. And so I can tell you an example of a study that looked at brain imaging to show changes in anatomy after practice. So in this study, what the researchers did was ask people to learn how to juggle. So first they measured their brain before they started practicing, and then the participants learned how to juggle until they could juggle 3 balls very well, and they could juggle for at least 1 minute without dropping a ball. And then they asked the subjects to come back to the scanner, and they measured the brain again, and they compared if there were any changes in anatomy for the brain before and after the training, before and after they learned how to juggle. So brain imaging allows us to see what's inside the living brain. So what you're seeing here are different pictures of the brain, and you're looking at different cross-sectional slices of the brain. So here you're looking at the side. Here you can see the eyeball. This is the back of the head. So as if you're looking at someone from their side. Here you're looking at the back of the brain. So you're looking from behind forward. So the person standing with their back to you, and you're looking towards them. And here you're looking from the top down, from the top to the bottom of the brain. So what you're seeing here is the parts of the brain that are highlighted in yellow in the left and the right hemisphere, here and here, are the parts of the brain that got bigger after practice for the jugglers. So these are the parts of the brain actually involved in seeing motion and in processing motion. And you see that there's an increase in connections. So the neurons probably grew more branches on a large, grew many more branches connecting, strengthening the motion perception while juggling. And you see this on a large scale when you image the entire brain. So besides looking at the anatomy, you can also use the magnet to look at function. So in this, to look at how the brain, the neurons are active during a certain task. So what you can do is you can ask the participant to lie down, and you can present a little screen in front, on top of their eyes, so they're looking at a screen, and you can ask them to do something, perform a certain task. So, for example, in here they were asked to press a button every time they saw one of the squares turn red. And then what you can do is you can measure the brain activity while they're doing this task, and it's to measure how much energy is being used by a certain part of the brain when you do something. And so this can kind of tell you, what brain areas perform what function. And that's, for example, when I talked about the motor route earlier, that's how we know that this area, the motor cortex, is the one that's involved in movement. For example, you can ask someone to go in the magnet and move their finger, and you can see that this part of the brain gets active when they're doing this. So another study looked at here's an example of function of a brain. And a second study looked at memorization training. So in this experiment, what the researchers did was ask participants to practice remembering lists of words, such as the one you saw before here. So as before, they measured the participants' brain before and after practice. So before they started training to do this memorization, and after they did training to do the memorization. So here the researchers didn't measure whether the brain got bigger or not, but instead they measured how much activity there was in the part of the brain that we use for memorizing things. So there's two parts, this one and this one. They showed that there was an increase in activity in this part of the brain. So what this means is that this part of the brain was now using more energy during the task, which is, for example, just like when you have a bigger muscle or a stronger muscle, you will use more energy to move it. So what this shows indirectly is that probably this part of the brain became bigger, or it became more efficient, means there were more connections between the neurons, or there were more chemicals released between the neurons and so forth. So one of the things that's important in these cognitive training tasks is the idea of transfer. So when you get better, it's the idea of looking at whether you get better at other things when you practice one thing. So for example, if you learned how to play chess, would you get better at learning a new language? So those are two completely different things that you wouldn't expect that you would. So if we go back to the brain like a muscle analogy, you can think about, for example, you can make your arms stronger by lifting weights. So you do a lot of bicep curls, for example. So now if you try to pull something heavy, no longer lifting a weight, but pulling something heavy, you would be better at it because your arm muscles are stronger. So in the same way, researchers are trying to find a training program that would make the brain overall stronger, or at least, let's say, all of the frontal cortex stronger, which will make you better at other things as well, not just the thing you trained at. So far, there hasn't been much evidence of transfer across practice to unpracticed tasks. So for example, if you practice planning, you get better at planning, but you don't get much better at memorization. So there are some exceptions, as I mentioned before, the action video games and some other tasks that do show this kind of transfer, so that's promising. But in fact, this is what we would like, because we want cognitive training to result in an overall increase in the quality of life. And so we think that maybe what we want is that we just haven't found the right cognitive training tasks yet. So we haven't found the tasks that make, for example, the entire frontal cortex stronger. which would be beneficial to different kinds of cognitive skills. So luckily, there's lots of potential to find new tasks or combinations of training tasks that will transfer to other cognitive skills other than the one you practiced at. So the two studies that I talked to you about till now were people, there were younger people, older, healthy people, and indeed there hasn't been much research that looks specifically on the benefits of cognitive training with people with Parkinson. So there are a couple of studies I'm mentioning here, and both are very promising because they do show transfer, and they show that training works for people with Parkinson. So one is a cognitive training task that the researchers used with Sudoku, and what they showed was that in fact did change the brain activation in the frontal cortex, and it did show some transfer. So the people who did this, who trained with Sudoku, also got better in another cognitive task. Another researcher tried this idea of doing cognitive training but using multiple tasks in any case, so doing memorization and planning and so forth. And they showed that they got better, of course, in the task that they trained in, because practice makes perfect. But they also showed some transfer to some of the tasks that they hadn't trained in. So again, there's lots of potential for cognitive training improving various cognitive skills in Parkinson's disease, and also in general for older, younger, everybody. So next I'm going to talk to you about my research project. So I'm just beginning the project. So unfortunately, I don't have lots of results to show you, but I'd like to talk to you about what I'm doing. So this research project is based on eye movement. So we will use eye movement control to measure and to train the brain. And so one of the most common eye movements we make are saccades. And so this is when you look all around the world to look at different things around you, just like probably you're doing in the slide, looking from here to here, up, reading this. You're making a lot of saccades. So what we will do is use two different kinds of eye movements. The first kind of eye movements or saccades. So the first kind of saccades we do are called prosaccades. So in this task, prosaccades. So this task, this is what the participant would see. So they would look at a dot in front of them, computer screen, and there's a green dot, which tells them they should be looking at the green dot. That's what they do. And then what happens is a target comes up, so on the left or right, somewhere on the screen. And the green tells them to look at the target as soon as it appears. So it's pretty easy to do. It's a prosaccade. So once it appeared, you just look at it kind of automatically. You can try this again. So the green, and once it appears, you just look at it. So it's a very easy eye movement to make. The second type of eye movement is much harder, and this is what we call the the anti-saccade. So in the anti-saccade, this time you see a red dot. So the dot in the middle is like a stoplight. It's not green like the ghosting. So what this tells the participant is that when the target appears, they should not look at it, and instead they should look away from it. So they should look in the direction opposite to where it is. So for example, if it appeared, let's say the target appeared here, you would not look in this direction. Instead, you would look here somewhere in empty space. So you can try this if you'd like. So when the target appears, look opposite to it. Okay. So it's quite difficult, I'm sure. So you might have probably automatically looked at it and then maybe made another saccade up to here to try and correct the error. So what you have to do here is two things. One, you have to stop from making that automatic saccade. So you always want to look at something when it happens. And then you have to make a new eye movement to somewhere where there's nothing to look at. So you have to make an eye movement to this part in black where there's nothing of interest. So like you might have done, what participants do is generally they can't, this is the correct eye movement to make, which is to automatically look from here to there. But instead, generally what people will do, tend to do on some trials, is you automatically look here, so you didn't stop that automatic saccade, and then you go the wrong way and look at the target. And this happens a certain percentage of time for everybody, except 20-year-olds who are, the height of their cognitive abilities, and they tend to make very few errors. Okay. So people with Parkinson's actually make anti-saccade errors, or they look the wrong way. They look at the target when they're supposed to be looking at the other way, 23% of the time, so about a quarter of the time. And this is compared to age-matched controls. So people of the same age that do not have Parkinson's, and they make errors about 10% of the time. So 1 in 10 trials, they might look the wrong way. And we think that the reason there's this increase in anti-saccade errors with Parkinson's is because of problems sending messages from the basal ganglia to the frontal cortex. And in fact, the reason why we're doing these anti-saccade eye movements is because they involve the same part of the brain that is involved in thinking, so the frontal cortex. So you see that here I'm showing you another picture of the brain, which shows where all the different areas that control eye movements are. So here's the front of the brain again, and the back of the brain, the eyeball. And you see all these areas in blue are involved in eye movements, and specifically these areas in the frontal cortex are involved specifically in anti-saccades. And you see that they're also connected to the basal ganglia, which is this area here. So what it's saying is that so these are the two kind of areas that are most important in making anti-saccades, which is, again, you're trying to stop an automatic movement and you're trying to make a movement into empty part of space. So as you can see, because it's the same part of the brain, the frontal cortex, that's involved in the cognitive skills or difficulties, and the basal ganglia as well. That's why we think that our hypothesis is that if we train participants to get better at making anti-saccades, then this will change the frontal cortex, and that therefore this might help improve other cognitive abilities. Okay. So in fact, when if we compare brain activity in people with Parkinson's while they're doing anti-saccades and control participants, so the same age-matched group that does not have Parkinson's disease, we find that there's less activity for Parkinson's disease in the frontal cortex compared to the controls. So here you're looking at an average brain of a person with Parkinson's disease. It's the same brain, and here we're showing the activity for a group of patients with Parkinson's disease and a group of controls. And you're looking at the brain from above down. And this area here is the frontal cortex, the one I've been talking about. This is the parietal cortex, which is also another area involved in eye movement. And you see this is a control. And what you can see is that there's less activity for people with Parkinson's disease compared to the control. And this agrees with the idea of problems of receiving messages from the basal ganglia. So the logic is that through training, we might increase activation in this area and therefore improve behavior, which means that they'll make less anti-saccade errors, and then also that they will be transferred to other cognitive skills. So my overall plan is to test the training task on patients with Parkinson's, but there's a few steps I need to do before I get there. So right now I'm testing younger people, and the reason I do this is because they're very good at useful for establishing baseline and to test, for example, transfer to other non-practice tasks. So we ask whether they get better at anti-saccades at all with training. So can you get better at, are anti-saccades trainable? And second, whether this transfers to other cognitive abilities. So here what I show you is that this is kind of typical of the type of stimulus that the types of tasks that the younger group would do. So they do the anti-saccade test, but the targets could appear pretty much anywhere, so it's even harder. And so we get the participants to do this training exercise every day for about half an hour for about 10 days, and they did maybe 200 trials a day, so they did this about 200 times, so they're practicing always doing the correct anti-saccades. And here what I'm going to show you is the results. So this is the percentage of correct anti-saccades they made. So 0 means they made 0 anti-saccades correctly, and 100% means they made every single anti-saccade correctly. They never went to look at the target. And this is the day of training, so day 1 to day 10. Now what you see is that they in fact did get better. So at the beginning for day 1, they were only 50%, they did only 50% correct. So the reason they're much higher than the numbers I told you before is this is a very extremely hard task because the targets appear anywhere, as opposed to a typical anti-saccade where the target would only appear on the left and the right. But you see that as the days go by, they get better and better. So by the time they're on the 10th day of training, they're already at 80% correct. So they are improving, and anti-saccades are trainable for the younger group. And we also showed that not only do they get better, but they get faster in making the eye movement as well. So here I'm looking at reaction time in milliseconds. So here, for example, this is a quarter of a second. And again, I get across days only for the ones where they made the correct anti-saccades. So for the task where they correctly went away from the target when it came up. And you see that they also get faster at making it. So they're processing this information faster and getting better in that way. So they're making less mistakes and getting faster at doing the right thing. So this is promising because it means that cognitive training on anti-saccades works. But generally, we know that you do get better at something you practice. So the important thing is to see if this training transfers to other tasks that also use the frontal cortex. So I have the results from one task, which is known as the visual search task. So the visual search task looks at how well you can find something among other things. So this is like looking in the kitchen drawer for a specific item. And so for our testing, we use 2 types of visual search. Sorry, someone said that the pointer doesn't move. Does it move now? Okay, great. Sometimes I put it to the side because I didn't want to point at something. So this is like a regular, what am I talking about? So one is known as pop-out. This is a pop-out visual search. And this is where only one thing is different and all the rest are the same. So you can see it's really relatively easy. So this is like, say you had a drawer full of marbles with one pen, and it would be really easy to find the pen amongst the drawers. So this task is very easy for subjects to do. The second type of search task, which we call a serial visual search task. So here it's the same thing. You want to find the target, which is the one that's different from the rest, but it's much more difficult. So if you have to look through pretty much all of them before you find it, and it's the one here. So this is more like a regular kitchen drawer where you're trying to find a pair of scissors among knives and all kinds of other things that are silver. So you have to pretty much look at each one before you find the one you want. And so because it's harder to do, the serial search takes longer than the pop-out search. So here are the results for 2 groups of participants that we tested. So this is for the pop-out, where it's just the one that sticks out and it's very easy to find. And so we had one group of participants that did the training and another group that did not do the training. And so what we're looking at is how long it took the participants to press a button to say that they found the target. And we're going to show the results for before they tested, before they did the training with the anti-saccade task, and after they did the training with the anti-saccade task. So what you see is that when they did have training, they already started, they were faster in general. I'm not sure why there's this difference here, but before training, they were quite fast. And then before they trained, and then after they were done training and they did the task again, they got a little bit better. But for the group that did not do any anti-saccade training, you see that they were already quite high before, but the important thing is the difference between the before and the after. And after, so they didn't have any training, so it's just after 2 weeks, you see that they got worse in the reaction times than the first time. So they kind of got tired or bored, but they did not get better. So it's promising that even though this change is very small, it's not an increase in reaction times. It didn't get slower like the group that didn't get training. So for the serial condition, what we saw is, in fact, with training, they got much, much better. So this is the purple line. So they started at around 1 second to find the task on average, the target on average. But after 2 weeks of training, they improved. They were much better. And with training, with no training, they also got slightly better, but the change was bigger for the task for the group that did the training compared to the group that did not do the training. So the results are hopeful, and they suggest that maybe the training task might show improvements in other cognitive abilities. So this is, of course, just for the younger group of participants. So next we have to try the older group as well. So older people and younger people are different. It's something that might not work so well for the younger people, might work really well for the older group, and vice versa. And then finally, I would like to test people with Parkinson's and hope that it improves cognitive abilities with them as well. So in the long run, what we want to see is whether it changes brain activation. And further on, perhaps if it's successful to this stage, we might think that it might help also motor symptoms as well if it has an influence on basal ganglia, not just on the frontal cortex. So we're just at the beginning of this research project, so it'll be a few years. But in the meantime, what you can do is you can take advantage of the multitude of other studies that show that exercising your brain works. And this works for everybody, for younger people, older people, people with Parkinson's, everyone. So basically, it's true that you have to use it or you lose it. And as you get older, your brain ages as well. So it's important to keep your brain healthy. And so you can practice different things, like different tasks. So for example, there's a bunch of online computer brain training tasks, such as which you can do online, but they cost something. So these are things like Luminosity or Cognifit or Insight. I don't think they're necessary personally, because what they do is they do regulate. So they give you a kind of it tells you what to do every day and all the time. So in that case, that's useful, but it's not necessary. You can do other things like games on the iPad or the Wii, such as the hidden objects games, which help you focus attention and so forth. The memory games, matching games like the ones the kids play. Action games are great. So if you can't stand to shoot somebody, you could probably drive, race with people and things. And those are really excellent games. So borrow your children's Wiis and their PlayStations and have fun playing. Brain games also useful. There's all these different kinds of brain training games you can use. But there's also a whole bunch of non-computer games to try. So these are things like crossword games, crossword puzzles, memory games, Sudoku I mentioned before. Board games are great. Bridge is awesome. Very, very difficult. So it's a great learning, great thing to learn and train your brain. Learning a new language, dancing. Basically, the idea is that you want to keep learning anything new. So if you play crossword games, like, and you get very good at it and you're excellent at it, it's not helping you anymore. You want to do things that you're bad at, so that there's a chance for improvement. So I've gotten really, really good at Sudoku, so I stopped playing it, and now I'm switching to crossword games, which I'm terrible at. So, but it's the idea that if your brain hurts, it's working really well. Something's happening. And of course, I highlight physical exercise because it's one of the most important things you can do. Physical exercise releases all kinds of endorphins in your brain, which combined with one of the other things, like combined with learning something new, really boosts brain function and activity. So that's all I have to say. Just keep practicing and learning new things and enjoying yourself, meeting new people. Go dancing, which is a perfect mix of learning something new and physical exercise. And in the meantime, I will continue my research. So just to conclude, Parkinson's disease can also have cognitive difficulties, so these non-motor symptoms, such as attention and memory, and not just motor symptoms. And cognitive training has the potential to improve cognitive abilities. So there's a lot of potential, but a lot of research that still needs to be done. And my project specifically will look at how we can maybe improve cognitive abilities using eye movement training. So I'd just like to finish by thanking the Parkinson Society of Canada, especially the Peterborough chapter. I had a fellowship from the Parkinson Society that helped begin this project. And I work mainly with the research group at Queen's University at the Center for Neuroscience Studies, and also had additional funding support from CIHR. Thank you very much.
have any questions, you can type bottom right and Arlene will answer them.
Do you know, someone said that Dalhousie University is doing a simpler study. Do you know the researchers that were involved in that?
Okay, we have one question. My concern is that I have a loved one in the LTC facility and this type of training is not available as far as I know. Am I wrong? Would you know that?
No, you're not wrong. I think because this one specifically is just the study that I've started, so it will not be available there. But if they're still capable of learning something new or crossword puzzles or some other kind of task, that would be useful.
Next question. Would you suggest trying anti-saccade exercises at home?
Um, Eventually, yes, but for now, I think the other games or the action games and stuff would be more useful. The anti-saccade has to be uh, put in.
Next, Stacy, yes, if you would like a copy of the PowerPoint, you can contact me and I can forward one along. I'm Christopher Havelsey. Next question. Is there any research on the use of interactive metronome on Parkinson's? Oh, Arlene seems to have dropped from the webinar. I will give her a moment to see if she can log back in. This webinar will be posted online. If you give me 1 second, I'd be happy to post the web address. You can use this link that I've just posted. It will be posted most likely by Monday. Okay, I see Arlene is back. I've made you a presenter. You should be able to talk.
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. The connection got lost.
That's okay. Someone asked a question. 1 second. Is there any research on the use of interactive metronome on Parkinson's?
Oh, sorry, I don't know what that is. I'm not really aware of that.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay then, I'd like to thank Arlene for taking the time to host this webinar. It was very informative and we very much appreciate it at Parkinson Society Ontario. And as I've said, I will be uploading the webinar hopefully by Monday. So thank you everyone for coming and that's everything.
Thank you.